Some acts of kindness are so quiet that only the guilty ever notice them. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe dignity can survive even in the darkest corners of power, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay until the end. Tonight's story begins with a mystery no one inside the Kang estate could explain. Every night at exactly 10 o'clock, the same shadow slipped through the servant's entrance carrying a small brown paper bag. The security cameras had recorded it for 43 consecutive nights. No one reported it. No one questioned it. No one even realized the shadow belonged to one of the quietest women working inside the mansion. Brielle Carter had been employed at Kang's estate for just under 8 months. She was known for polishing marble floors until they reflected the chandeliers like still water, for arriving before sunrise, and for leaving long after the other employees had disappeared into the city. She spoke softly, smiled rarely, and moved with the practiced rhythm of someone who had learned that being invisible was often the safest way to survive. To everyone else, she was simply the Black Maid. To Kang, she was someone whose name he had barely noticed. His world operated according to discipline. Every camera angle, every security checkpoint, every movement around the mansion existed for one reason: control. Nothing crossed the estate without permission. Nothing happened beyond his knowledge. Or so he believed. The notification arrived while Ethan sat alone in his private office overlooking the Seoul skyline. Rain streaked across the floor-to-ceiling windows, blurring the lights into rivers of gold. A muted jazz record played from an antique speaker while reports from rival organizations lay untouched across his mahogany desk. His head of security stepped inside. "Sir, there's something unusual." Ethan didn't raise his eyes. "What is it?" "It isn't a threat." Only then did Ethan glance toward the monitor the guard had placed before him. Black and white footage flickered onto the screen. There she was. Brielle emerged from the servants' hallway carrying a neatly folded paper bag pressed carefully against her chest. She looked over each shoulder, not with the panic of someone committing a crime, but with the caution of someone protecting a secret. She reached the massive iron gate. She knelt, placed the bag gently on the pavement outside, adjusted it so it wouldn't tip over. Then she quietly returned inside without saying a single word. Ethan frowned. "Open yesterday's recording." The footage repeated. Exactly the same. Another night. Another identical bag. Another silent departure. Again and again. For 43 nights. No visitor ever collected the food while the cameras watched. No homeless person appeared. No delivery driver stopped. The bags simply vanished before dawn. His security chief cleared his throat. "Should we stop her tomorrow, sir?" Ethan leaned back, his expression unreadable. In his world, people only hid two things: fear or loyalty. Neither possibility made sense. A maid earning barely enough to support herself had somehow managed to prepare fresh meals every single night, using her own time, asking for nothing, leaving no explanation. He tapped one finger against the wooden desk. "No." The single word froze everyone in the room. "Leave her alone." The guards exchanged uncertain glances. Ethan's eyes never left the screen as Brielle disappeared into the darkness once again. For reasons he couldn't explain, the mystery bothered him far more than the criminal negotiations waiting in front of him. He replayed the final seconds one last time. The way she carefully straightened the paper bag. The almost motherly gentleness in her movements. The tiny smile that crossed her face before she walked back through the gate. It was not the smile of someone hiding guilt. It was the smile of someone hoping another person would wake up tomorrow with one less reason to suffer. Ethan slowly stood and buttoned his charcoal suit jacket. Outside, thunder rolled across the city. Tomorrow night, he decided, there would be no cameras, no reports, no security briefings. Only him. He would follow the woman everyone else had forgotten to see. And before dawn arrived, Kang was about to discover that the smallest act of kindness could challenge everything a man of power believed about strength. The following evening, Seoul disappeared beneath a curtain of cold rain, the kind that blurred neon lights into shimmering rivers across empty streets. At precisely 9:57 p.m., Kang dismissed his security team with a command that stunned everyone in the mansion. "No one follows her." The guards exchanged uncertain glances. "But, sir," I said, "no one." His voice remained calm, yet absolute. Questions died before they reached anyone's lips. 3 minutes later, Ethan stood alone inside the security control room, watching the familiar monitor. Right on time, Brielle Carter emerged from the servants' corridor wearing the same worn gray coat she always carried after work. Her dark curls were tucked beneath a knitted cap, and a simple brown paper bag rested carefully in her hands, as though it contained something far more valuable than food. She paused beneath the porch light, looked toward the empty driveway, then quietly slipped through the iron gate. Ethan waited exactly 30 seconds before leaving through another exit. For a man whose life revolved around armored vehicles, bodyguards, and carefully planned routes, walking alone through the quiet streets felt strangely unfamiliar. He kept several yards behind Brielle, moving without sound despite the rain collecting on his tailored black overcoat. She never looked back. Not once. As the distance between the mansion and the city's wealthy district grew wider, Ethan noticed the surroundings changing. Luxury boutiques disappeared. Glass towers gave way to aging apartment buildings. Fresh pavement became cracked sidewalks lined with flickering convenience stores and rusted streetlights. It was a part of Seoul few powerful men ever visited voluntarily. Brielle continued walking with quiet determination, unaffected by the rain soaking through her sleeves. 20 minutes later, she reached a narrow alley Ethan had never seen before. Instead of stopping at the first house, she placed the paper bag gently beside a faded blue door. She didn't knock. She didn't ring the bell. She simply adjusted the bag to keep it dry beneath a small awning before walking away. Ethan remained hidden behind a delivery truck. Several minutes passed. Nothing happened. Then the blue door creaked open. A little girl, no older than 8, stepped outside wearing oversized slippers. She looked carefully in both directions before spotting the paper bag. Her face lit up. "Mama," she whispered excitedly. "We have dinner." She hugged the bag against her tiny chest as though someone had handed her treasure before disappearing back inside. Ethan's expression remained unreadable, but something unfamiliar settled quietly inside him. Brielle had already disappeared farther down the alley. She wasn't finished. Curiosity pulled Ethan after her. The second stop was an elderly man's apartment. Again, no knocking, no conversation, only another carefully placed meal. Minutes later, an old hand reached through the doorway, picked up the package, and quietly bowed toward the empty street. Not knowing the woman he thanked had already vanished around the corner. The third stop surprised Ethan even more. A young mother carrying an infant opened the door almost immediately, as though she had been waiting. She smiled through exhausted eyes. "There she is again," she whispered softly to herself. "God bless whoever you are." Brielle never heard the words. She was already crossing another intersection, carrying nothing now except an empty cloth bag folded beneath her arm. Ethan slowed his pace. His mind searched desperately for logic. Was this charity? Repayment? A secret organization? Nothing fit. She used no cameras, accepted no praise, left no notes, collected no donations. Every gesture suggested one simple truth. She wanted no one to know. As Brielle turned toward another quiet street, Ethan noticed something else. She smiled. Not the polite smile servants wore around wealthy employers. Not the cautious smile people forced to survive. This one was different. Small. Peaceful. As if every empty paper bag made her heart just a little lighter. For the first time in years, Ethan Kang found himself wondering whether true strength had nothing to do with fear, power, or wealth. Perhaps it looked exactly like the woman walking silently ahead of him, disappearing into the rain. Before anyone could ever say, "Thank you," Ethan should have turned back after the third house. That would have been the sensible decision. He had already learned enough to satisfy his curiosity. Brielle Carter wasn't working for a charity, wasn't meeting an informant, and certainly wasn't betraying the Kang organization. She was simply feeding strangers in silence. Yet something deep inside him refused to leave. There was a pattern hidden beneath her kindness, and for the first time in years, Ethan found himself chasing a mystery that couldn't be solved with money or violence. Keeping a careful distance, he watched as Brielle entered another neighborhood, older than the last. The apartment buildings here leaned slightly with age, their concrete walls stained by decades of rain. Laundry fluttered from tiny balconies despite the weather, and warm yellow lights glowed behind thin curtains. She stopped in front of another door. Unlike the previous homes, this one had a small flower pot sitting beside the entrance. The flowers had long since died, leaving only dry stems reaching toward the night sky. Brielle gently placed her final paper bag beside the pot. Before walking away, she paused. Very slowly, she knelt and straightened the wilted stems with remarkable care, as though someone inside might smile simply because the flowers looked less forgotten. Then she stood, smiled softly, and disappeared around the corner. Ethan remained hidden across the street. Seconds later, the door opened. An elderly woman stepped outside, supporting herself with a wooden cane. She noticed the paper bag immediately, but didn't pick it up. Instead, she looked toward the empty street with eyes filled with quiet gratitude. "I prayed you'd come tonight," she whispered into the darkness. "I'm sorry I have nothing to give you." Only after speaking those words did she collect the meal and slowly return inside. Ethan lowered his gaze. There had been no cameras, no audience, no recognition. Everything Brielle did vanished the moment she walked away. Most people performed kindness hoping someone would notice. She seemed determined that no one ever would. As he continued following the empty streets she had taken, Ethan began noticing details he had ignored before. A stray cat sleeping beneath a newspaper, an old bicycle chained to a rusted fence, children's drawings taped inside apartment windows. These were ordinary things, invisible things, the kind his life had trained him to overlook. Power had taught him to study threats. Brielle seemed to study people. When he finally reached the corner where she had disappeared, he stopped abruptly. She was gone. No footsteps, no taxi, no sound, only rain falling against silent pavement. His eyes scanned every direction until he noticed a narrow staircase descending beneath the street toward an older section of the district. He followed. At the bottom stood a modest grocery store that was preparing to close for the evening. Through the front window, Ethan saw Brielle speaking with the elderly shopkeeper. She handed him a small envelope. The old man counted the bills before shaking his head. "You still owe too much," he said gently. "I know," Brielle replied with a tired smile. "I'll work extra shifts next week." The shopkeeper sighed. "You could spend this money on yourself." She looked toward the empty shelves where fresh bread had once been displayed. "I already have enough." Ethan watched as the old man quietly filled another paper bag, adding fruit that Brielle hadn't paid for. She noticed immediately. "You added too much." "So did you," the old man answered. "For months." Neither of them said another word. Brielle bowed respectfully, lifted the bag, and walked back into the rain. Ethan remained frozen outside the store. She wasn't using leftovers from the mansion. She wasn't spending the Kang family's money. Every meal came from her own wages, from overtime, from sacrifices no one had ever bothered to see. For years, Ethan had believed loyalty was measured by what people were willing to take. Tonight, a quiet woman carrying a paper bag was teaching him that true character was measured by what someone was willing to give away. And somewhere deep beneath the armor he had spent a lifetime building, something almost forgotten stirred for the very first time. The next morning, Ethan Kang couldn't remember the last time a single ordinary person had occupied his thoughts before sunrise. His executive schedule waited neatly arranged across the dining table. Meetings with foreign investors, discussions over shipping routes, intelligence reports from rival syndicates, matters that normally demanded every ounce of his attention. Today, he barely looked at them. Instead, his mind kept returning to one impossible image. A black maid counting crumpled bills beneath the dim lights of a neighborhood grocery store, just to make sure strangers she would never meet again had something warm to eat. The image refused to leave him. Later that afternoon, Ethan stood before the enormous window inside his private office, while Seoul stretched endlessly below. His chief of security entered carrying the daily report. "Everything is secure, sir." Ethan remained silent. After several uneasy seconds, he finally asked, "Tell me about Brielle Carter." The question caught the man completely off guard. "Our maid, sir." "Yes." The guard quickly opened his tablet. 32 years old. Originally from Atlanta. No criminal record. Employed here 8 months ago through a domestic staffing agency. Excellent performance reviews. Never late. Never complains. Family. No immediate relatives in Korea. Debt. A small personal loan. Medical history. Nothing significant. The report ended there. Everything about Brielle looked painfully ordinary. Almost invisible. Yet Ethan now understood that official files could reveal facts without ever telling the truth. The woman described on paper and the woman he had followed through the rain were not the same person. That evening, Ethan quietly changed his routine. Instead of dining alone in the formal hall, he wandered into the mansion's service kitchen just before the night staff finished preparing tomorrow's breakfast ingredients. Conversations stopped the instant he entered. Several employees lowered their heads nervously. No one could remember the last time the boss had stepped inside this room. Ethan ignored the anxious silence. His eyes found Brielle immediately. She stood near the stainless steel counter peeling vegetables with calm, practiced movements. Her sleeves were rolled neatly to her elbows, and despite working since dawn, there wasn't a trace of frustration on her face. She looked exactly the same as she had the previous night. Quiet, focused, invisible. She noticed Ethan only when another employee accidentally dropped a tray. Looking up, Brielle bowed politely. "Good evening, sir." Nothing more. No fear. No attempt to impress him. No hint that she recognized the man who had secretly followed her through the city. Ethan studied her for several long seconds. Her hands moved with remarkable care, even while slicing ordinary carrots. Nothing was rushed. Nothing wasted. She treated simple work with the same patience she had shown those paper bags. The head chef hurried over. "Sir, is something wrong?" Ethan glanced toward the nearly empty pantry shelves. "How much food do we throw away every week?" The chef hesitated. "I'm not exactly sure." "Find out." "Yes, sir." Ethan turned toward the exit before stopping once more. Without looking back, he spoke quietly. "From now on, nothing edible leaves this kitchen unless I approve it." The room fell completely silent. Several workers exchanged confused glances. They assumed the boss wanted tighter control over inventory. Only Ethan knew the real reason. He wanted to understand whether kindness could be organized, or whether it only existed because people like Brielle sacrificed something of themselves. As he walked down the long marble hallway, another question surfaced. Why that particular neighborhood? Why those specific families? Why had one house with dead flowers seemed especially important to her? There was a story still hidden beneath everything he had seen, and Ethan had spent his entire life learning one lesson above all others. Every secret begins with a choice someone made long before anyone started asking questions. Somewhere in Brielle Carter's past, there was a promise powerful enough to survive exhaustion, long shifts, empty pockets, and 43 nights of silent generosity. Ethan intended to uncover it, not because he suspected betrayal anymore, but because, for the first time in many years, he wanted to understand what could make an ordinary human being choose compassion over comfort every single night. That night, Ethan Kang broke a rule he had never broken before. He returned to the neighborhood before Brielle did. The black sedan that usually carried one of Korea's most feared men remained parked several blocks away. Dressed in a simple charcoal jacket instead of an expensive tailored suit, Ethan walked the narrow streets alone, blending into the evening crowd as much as someone like him ever could. He stopped in front of the little grocery store. The elderly owner recognized him immediately, not by name, but by the unmistakable posture of a man accustomed to command. "Can I help you?" the old man asked cautiously. Ethan glanced around the nearly empty shop before speaking. "I came to ask about the woman who buys food here every night." The shopkeeper's expression changed instantly. "I'm afraid I don't discuss my customers." Ethan respected the answer. Most people feared powerful men. This old man simply protected someone else's dignity. Instead of insisting, Ethan quietly reached into his pocket and placed several crisp bills on the wooden counter. "I don't want information." The old man looked down at the money without touching it. "I want every meal she buys from today forward to be paid for." Silence settled between them. Finally, the shopkeeper pushed the money back across the counter. "I can't do that." Ethan frowned. "Why not?" "Because she'd stop coming." The answer surprised him. If she discovered someone else was paying, she'd think the promise wasn't hers anymore. Promise. There was that word again. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "What promise?" The old man looked toward the rain-covered window. For several long seconds, he said nothing. Then he sighed. 5 years ago, she came here hungry. Ethan remained perfectly still. She had just arrived in Korea. No family. No friends. No job. She asked if she could buy half a loaf of bread because that was all the money she had. The old man smiled faintly at the memory. "I gave her the whole loaf." Outside, headlights swept across the wet street before disappearing again. The next morning she came back and tried to repay me. I refused. So she made me another promise instead. The shopkeeper's eyes softened. She said that one day, when she was finally able to stand on her own feet, no one around her would ever go to bed hungry if she could help it. Ethan slowly looked toward the shelves where fresh bread was cooling behind glass. She's been keeping that promise ever since. The old man nodded. Even when she skips dinner herself. The words landed harder than Ethan expected. He remembered watching Brielle count every bill. He remembered her saying she already had enough. Perhaps she hadn't. Perhaps she had simply decided someone else needed it more. The shopkeeper quietly arranged fresh fruit into another paper bag. Do you know something remarkable? Ethan remained silent. She remembers every birthday. What? Every child she helps receives an extra apple and a handwritten note on their birthday. The old man smiled. She says no child should feel forgotten. A strange heaviness settled inside Ethan's chest. His own birthdays had always been celebrated with expensive gifts, private security, and influential guests. Yet he couldn't remember the last sincere letter anyone had written him. Meanwhile, the woman who scrubbed the floors of his mansion spent her tiny paycheck, making sure strangers felt remembered. Just then, the bell above the shop door chimed softly. Brielle stepped inside, smiling politely as always. She hadn't seen Ethan. He quietly slipped through the back entrance before she reached the counter. Standing alone in the alley behind the store, Ethan listened to the muffled sound of their friendly conversation through the brick wall. For the first time in decades, the feared mafia boss wasn't trying to uncover someone's weakness. He was trying to understand the extraordinary strength hidden inside the gentlest person he had ever met. And somewhere deep within him, a decision had already begun taking shape, though neither Brielle nor Ethan yet realized how profoundly it would change both of their lives. The answer Ethan had been searching for was waiting behind the only door Brielle never passed without stopping. 3 nights later, he returned to the neighborhood alone. This time, he did not follow her. He arrived an hour after she had already left. The small apartment with the faded blue door stood quietly beneath a flickering street lamp. The dead flower pot still rested beside the entrance, but someone had placed a fresh white daisy in the middle of the dry stems. Ethan knocked gently. After a long pause, the door opened. The elderly woman he had seen before looked up with cautious eyes. "Can I help you?" Ethan lowered his voice. "I'd like to ask about the young woman who leaves food here." For several seconds, the woman simply studied his face. Then, without another word, she stepped aside. "Come in." The apartment was painfully modest. A tiny wooden table, 2 aging chairs, a bookshelf with more empty spaces than books. The air smelled faintly of tea and old photographs. Ethan noticed dozens of framed pictures covering one wall. Most showed neighborhood children laughing during birthdays, holiday dinners, or school graduations. In nearly every photograph, Brielle stood in the background, never in the center, never posing, always smiling quietly while someone else received the attention. The elderly woman noticed where Ethan was looking. She always hides from the camera. Ethan remained silent. She says the memory should belong to the people receiving kindness, not the person giving it. The old woman slowly poured 2 cups of tea. "I suppose you're wondering why she never misses this house." Ethan nodded once. The woman smiled sadly. Because this was the first place that ever welcomed her. She reached beneath the table and carefully unfolded an old newspaper clipping. Its edges had yellowed with age. 5 years earlier, a photograph showed a much younger Brielle sitting outside a train station during winter, wrapped in a thin blanket, while volunteers distributed emergency meals. She had nowhere to sleep, the woman whispered. She had been searching for work for weeks. Ethan looked closer. Brielle's face appeared exhausted, yet she was smiling at the elderly volunteer handing her a bowl of soup. That volunteer, the old woman touched the picture gently, was my husband. Silence filled the room. He brought Brielle here that night because the shelters were full. Her voice trembled. We had almost nothing ourselves. She laughed softly through damp eyes. 2 bowls of soup and 1 spare blanket. She looked toward the empty chair across the room. My husband died 6 months later. Before Ethan could respond, the woman continued. The day before his funeral, Brielle came back. She promised me something. The elderly woman closed her eyes, remembering every word. As long as I have 2 meals, she said, one of them will belong to someone who needs it more than I do. Ethan felt the sentence settle heavily inside him, not as dramatic words, as a lifelong commitment. The old woman smiled toward the photographs. Every week she visits me. Not because I need food anymore, but because she says no one who showed kindness should ever grow old feeling forgotten. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the window. Ethan rose from his chair and quietly walked toward the wall of photographs. For years he had built an empire that forced people to remember his name through fear. Yet the woman cleaning the floors of his mansion had built something infinitely greater. She had built memories, families, hope, one quiet promise at a time. As Ethan prepared to leave, the elderly woman spoke one final sentence. You know, he stopped. She still believes no one knows what she does every night. Ethan looked back with quiet respect. No, he answered softly. And for now, let's keep it that way. When the apartment door closed behind him, Ethan stood alone beneath the rain, realizing he no longer wanted to solve Brielle Carter's mystery. He wanted to protect it, even if protecting that promise meant changing the course of his own life forever. Sometimes, the cruelest attack against a kind person is not violence. It is suspicion. The storm arrived on an ordinary Friday morning. The Kang estate buzzed with unusual activity as several executives gathered for an important business luncheon. Servants hurried through polished hallways carrying silver trays, while security personnel checked every entrance with military precision. Everything appeared perfectly normal, until the shouting began. A senior house manager stormed into the service kitchen holding an expensive velvet jewelry box. It's gone. Every conversation stopped. The diamond watch Mr. Kang received yesterday has disappeared. Within seconds, panic spread through the mansion. Doors were locked. Employees were ordered to remain where they stood. Security officers moved from room to room, searching lockers, uniforms, and supply closets. Brielle quietly placed the vegetables she had been washing back into the sink. She neither protested nor panicked. She simply waited. An hour later, one of the guards emerged from the staff changing room, carrying a familiar brown paper bag. This was hidden inside her locker. The room fell silent. The manager snatched the bag and emptied its contents across the stainless steel counter. Several apples rolled onto the floor. A loaf of bread, medicine, and beneath them, the missing diamond watch. Gasps echoed through the kitchen. I knew it, one employee whispered. She acted too perfect. Another shook his head. People always hide their true faces. Brielle stared at the watch in complete disbelief. Her lips parted, but no words came. Finally, she managed a quiet sentence. I've never seen that before. The manager laughed coldly. It was found in your locker. I don't know how it got there. You expect us to believe that? The accusations came faster than she could answer. Some looked away in disappointment. Others watched with quiet satisfaction, relieved that the mysterious generosity of the quiet maid had finally been exposed as deception. Only Brielle remained still. She did not scream. She did not beg. She simply looked at the scattered food lying across the cold floor. One of the apples had bruised when it rolled against the table leg. She bent down, picked it up, and gently wiped away the dust with her sleeve. The tiny gesture went unnoticed by almost everyone. Almost. From the second-floor balcony overlooking the central hall, Ethan Kang had witnessed everything. His face revealed nothing, but his eyes never left Brielle. Not for a single moment. He remembered. Every rainy night. Every hidden meal. Every promise. Every photograph. Every child. No person capable of living that way would destroy their own integrity for a luxury watch. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The security chief approached him. Sir, should we contact the police? The entire mansion waited for Ethan's answer. Downstairs, Brielle finally lifted her head. She did not plead for mercy. She did not ask Ethan to believe her. Perhaps because she knew that innocence often sounded weakest when forced to defend itself. Instead, she quietly folded the empty paper bag that had carried food meant for another family that evening. Her hands trembled only once. Then they became perfectly steady again. She accepted the humiliation in complete silence. Not because she had surrendered, but because some people would rather lose their reputation than lose their dignity. High above them, Ethan slowly descended the grand staircase. Each measured step echoed through the mansion like the ticking of a clock counting down to judgment. No one dared speak. No one moved. Every pair of eyes followed the mafia boss as he approached the frightened maid standing alone beside the scattered groceries. The room held its breath. Because everyone believed Ethan Kang was about to decide Brielle Carter's fate. No one realized. He had already decided whose side he was on before he ever reached the bottom step. The silence inside the mansion became heavier with every step Ethan Kang took. The diamond watch still rested on the stainless steel counter. The scattered groceries remained untouched. Every employee watched, waiting for the verdict only one man could deliver. Ethan stopped in front of Brielle. She kept her eyes lowered, not out of shame, but out of respect. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan bent down. To everyone's surprise, he ignored the expensive watch completely. Instead, he picked up the bruised apple Brielle had carefully cleaned only moments before. He turned it slowly in his hand. Then he looked directly at the security chief. "Tell me," Ethan said calmly. "When was this locker searched?" 10 minutes ago, sir." "And who searched it first?" The chief hesitated. "Our internal security team." "Names?" 3 guards immediately stepped forward. Ethan studied each face without changing his expression. "Show me the security footage." The manager frowned. "Sir, the evidence is already clear." Ethan never looked at him. "I wasn't asking for your opinion." The room fell silent once again. Minutes later, surveillance footage filled the large monitor in the central hall. Employees gathered around. The recording showed Brielle entering the changing room before sunrise. She placed her lunch bag inside her locker. Then she left for work. Nothing unusual. The video continued. 23 minutes later, another figure entered. A junior supervisor. He glanced nervously down the hallway before opening Brielle's locker with a master key. Gasps echoed through the room. He reached inside, placed something beneath the paper bag, closed the locker, and hurried away. The footage ended. Nobody spoke. The supervisor's face turned pale. It isn't what it looks like." Ethan finally looked at him. "No." The man collapsed to his knees. "I was paid." "By whom?" His voice trembled uncontrollably. "A charity foundation." Confused murmurs spread throughout the staff. Their director wanted publicity. They planned to expose Brielle as a fraud. They said if people stopped trusting her, everyone would donate to their campaign instead. The words felt almost impossible to believe. Someone had weaponized generosity, not to steal money, but to steal trust. Ethan's gaze hardened. "How much were you paid?" The supervisor whispered the amount. It was less than the watch itself. Far less than Brielle had quietly spent feeding strangers over the past 8 months. The irony settled over the room like cold rain. One person had sold his integrity for a small payment. Another had sacrificed nearly everything simply to keep strangers alive. Ethan stepped toward the counter. Without hesitation, he picked up the diamond watch. Then he placed it inside the same paper bag that had carried bread, fruit, and medicine. He handed the bag back to Brielle. "It belongs with honest hands." No one breathed. Brielle accepted it carefully. She removed the watch immediately and placed it on the counter beside Ethan. "I don't want it." Her voice remained soft. "It was never mine." Ethan nodded once. "I know." Then he turned toward every employee gathered in the kitchen. "You judged a woman because evidence was placed before your eyes." His voice remained calm. "But none of you asked whether the evidence matched the person." No one dared answer. "You saw one watch." "I saw 43 nights." Confused expressions spread through the room. Only Brielle looked up. For the first time since the accusation began, her eyes met Ethan's. Not with fear, with surprise. She realized then. He knew. Not everything, but enough. Enough to understand the paper bags. Enough to understand the promises. Enough to protect both. Ethan faced the trembling supervisor one final time. "You will leave this estate today." He paused. "And every organization involved in this deception will answer to me." No threats were necessary. Everyone understood exactly what those words meant. As security escorted the disgraced supervisor away, the kitchen remained perfectly still. The silence no longer belonged to suspicion. It belonged to truth. And in that unforgettable moment, every person in the room witnessed something far more valuable than a stolen diamond. They watched the dignity of a quiet woman return without her ever needing to demand it. The mansion returned to its familiar rhythm. Footsteps echoed through polished hallways. Breakfast was prepared before sunrise. Fresh flowers appeared in crystal vases each morning. To anyone passing by, nothing had changed. But everyone who worked inside the Kang estate knew something invisible had shifted forever. No one whispered when Brielle entered a room anymore. People greeted her first. Doors were held open. Heavy boxes quietly disappeared from her hands before she had to lift them. Respect had arrived without announcement. It had simply taken root. A week after the accusation, Ethan called a meeting with every household employee. No executives attended. No security advisors. Only the people whose work usually remained unnoticed. The servants stood quietly inside the grand dining hall, uncertain why they had been summoned. Ethan walked to the front without prepared notes. His gaze moved across every familiar face before resting briefly on Brielle. Then he spoke. This house has measured value by loyalty. He paused. Today, that changes. Several employees exchanged confused glances. From this day forward, every meal that remains untouched in this estate will be delivered before nightfall. The room grew still. No edible food will ever be thrown away again. He continued calmly. A new foundation will also begin operating immediately. No banners. No press conference. No public announcement. It will provide meals, medicine, and emergency assistance throughout the neighborhoods surrounding this estate. The manager carefully raised a hand. What shall we call the foundation, sir? Ethan looked toward the large windows where the morning sunlight spilled across the polished floor. After a long silence, he answered, It doesn't need my name. He turned toward Brielle. It should belong to the people who inspired it. Brielle immediately shook her head. No, sir. Her voice remained as gentle as ever. I don't want anyone to know. A faint smile appeared on Ethan's face. I know. That's why no one ever will. The foundation was launched quietly. No photographs. No interviews. No ceremonies. Every evening, anonymous deliveries began reaching shelters, elderly residents, struggling families, and forgotten apartment buildings across the city. Only a handful of trusted people knew who funded them. Even fewer knew who had inspired them. Months passed. One evening, Brielle walked toward the familiar blue door, carrying another paper bag. Before she could knock, she noticed something unusual. Fresh groceries already rested beside the flower pot. Medicine, bread, fruit. Exactly the things she normally brought herself. She looked around the empty street in confusion. No one was there. The elderly woman opened the door and smiled knowingly. I suppose kindness has found another traveler. Brielle looked down at the paper bag. There was no name. Only a small handwritten note. For promises worth protecting. She read the sentence twice. Then quietly smiled. Not because she knew who had written it, but because she understood that compassion had a remarkable way of multiplying when no one tried to own it. Across the city, inside the highest office of the Kang estate, Ethan watched the evening lights appear one by one beyond the windows. His empire still existed. His responsibilities had not disappeared. Neither had the dangers surrounding his life. But something inside him had become different. Power had once taught him how to control fear. Brielle Carter had taught him something infinitely harder. How to deserve respect. That night, another anonymous delivery reached another forgotten doorstep. Another child went to bed with a full stomach. Another elderly neighbor realized someone still remembered they existed. No speeches were given. No applause followed. Only quiet footsteps disappearing into the darkness. And somewhere in that silence, the world remembered a truth that money, influence, and power could never purchase. The greatest people are rarely the loudest. Sometimes they are simply the ones carrying a paper bag through the rain, believing that one small act of kindness can outlive every shadow. And that day, the world remembered what dignity looks like.